read the next few chapters of The Birthday Ball by Lois Lowry. Today we're going to start with Chapter 7, titled The Duke. A warthog has large upcurled tusks, and Duke Desmond, being human, had none. He did, however, have huge, crooked, brown-spotted teeth and a tuft of coarse copper-colored hair, the two features combined to make him resemble such an animal, so the princess was not inaccurate in her description. That his disposition was terrible was not surprising. In his defense, it must be said that any human who resembles a warthog is bound to be irresistible and testy. His own parents had found it distasteful to look at Desmond when he was young, and when he was a child, no other children had ever invited him to play. Such slights do affect one's personality. But Duke Desmond did have one attribute. He was immensely wealthy. Both of his parents had by now passed away, and Duke Desmond ruled the opulent principality of Dyspepsia and owned all of its wealth. Oil wells, gold mines, and huge vineyards. The income from all of these came to Desmond. He spent it on clothes and playthings and trinkets and baubles, but it continued to come. And with the money and the title came power. He was a very wealthy man. Such was his power that he had found a way to forget his own appearance. He had abolished not only all mirrors and looking glasses from dyspepsia, but also any shiny object that might throw back a reflection. When he traveled, he did so accompanied by bodyguards and courtiers, some of whom went ahead to be certain that all such reflectors were removed from his presence. So Duke Desmond had found a way to forget what he looked like. He had begun to think of his appearance as pleasing, and the servants he hired had been trained to address him as they might address a handsome man. Here's a picture of Duke Desmond as an illustration. Wow. He's a rough-looking guy. "How fine you look this morning, sir," his manservant would proclaim upon drawing open the curtains of the sleeping chamber each day. Duke Desmond would yawn and stretch, and then appear to smile. He never really smiled, but his large, protruding teeth made it impossible for him to close his lips. Years before, a previous manservant had foolishly suggested to the Duke that he brush his teeth, but that unfortunate servant had been confined in the dungeon ever since. By now, the teeth were mottled with decay and crusted with plaque. Perpetual toothache was a further reason for the Duke's bad disposition. No one dared suggest either that he comb his hair, or cut it. The coarse red-brown tuft at the top of his head was long and snarled. When he tossed his head, as he frequently did in fits of anger, the hair moved like a thick whip from side to side, and those in its path were in danger from it. One small serving maid had been knocked to the floor by the hair and had her braid permanently addled. The Duke's barrister had made a gift to the maid's family of a large sum of money to make up for it, and other servants had learned to stand clear in the future. I certainly would. The most heinous of individuals, and Duke Desmond was certainly one of those, all seemed to have a deeply hidden sorrow. For the Duke, it was that he had no child. Without a child, he had no heir. When he died, Duke Desmond knew with his wealth, his wells and mines and vineyards would all go to the populace. But that was not the whole of it. He wanted a child for another deeply human reason. He wanted someone to love him. And so he needed a wife. He had chosen Princess Patricia Priscilla. She's not going to be happy about that. It can be said, and has been said often, that money cannot buy happiness. But Duke Desmond thought that it could, and that he had figured out the way to bring it about. His spies had been sent to the domain where the princess lived with her parents in the castle. They went disguised as peddlers, carrying displays of hair products and encyclopedias. The queen, who began each day with a visit to her private beauty salon, welcomed the spy, who proclaimed that he carried a line of amazing shampoos and curling lotions newly invented by cloistered nuns in a distant and holy place. "Eh?" the queen said to the impostor peddler. "Blistered buns, you say?" "No, ma'am, cloistered nuns." "Holstered guns," she said. "Amazing! I'll take 300 of each." The king summoned the other spy to the counting house. He examined the encyclopedia and ordered several to be delivered to the royal library. The impostor peddler wrote down the order meticulously, but in truth his interest was not on the order, but on what the encyclopedia had most interested the king. It was volume B. It was specifically butterflies. Of course, the spy had noticed the elaborate shelves that housed the king's butterfly collection, and where the mounted winged creatures were on display with special lighting. They were arranged two ways, one by color, so that the lengthy shelf began with pale yellow and made its way through each gradation and hue. Oranges, reds, blues, greens, so that the wall seemed a rainbow. But the opposite wall held the same collection, duplicates arranged by scientific names. In the section marked Nymphkingidae, the spy saw the amazing multicolored Prepona pranestina. Nearby, under Ornithoptera, was the semi-translucent Papuana, and in the Papilionidae section, he marveled at the huge, deep orange Papio antimachus. I hope I pronounced those right. Yet on each wall, the spy noticed there was an empty spot. A label was attached. He could read Caryx's archeos, but there was no such mounted butterfly. Stealthily, in his little notebook, he wrote the name of the missing butterfly. "I noticed that one of your specimens is out for cleaning, sir," he commented. The king looked up from volume B of the encyclopedia. He saw that the spy was referring to the empty places on the shelves. His face fell. "Missing, rare," the king exclaimed. "Hard to acquire, working on it." And so the spy went back to Duke Desmond's principality with the knowledge of how money could indeed buy happiness, at least when happiness took the form of a rare butterfly. His fellow spy was glum, having acquired nothing but an order for 300 bottles of shampoo and 300 bottles of curling lotions. "Funnels," he muttered. "I'll have to do it with funnels." "Do what?" They were riding their horses side by side behind the cart that carried their samples. "Fill 600 bottles with soapy water." "You could just forget it. Often people order things that never arrive." The hair product spy considered that. Then he sighed. "Have you ever visited the dungeon?" "Oh, yes. I see what you mean." "Filled with people who did not fulfill promises." "Yes." "Dark and cold and lonely." "Yes." "I'll use funnels. And you?" "I got lucky. I'll tell the Duke he has to send someone to find and buy that butterfly." He took out his notepad and read the name of the missing specimen. "Whatever the cost." Back in his bedchamber, Duke Desmond was examining his clothing and deciding what to wear to the birthday ball. Green was good on him, he thought. Seductive. Maybe spandex, which would outline his rounded stomach in an attractive way. Tights, probably. And pointed shoes. Yes, definitely, pointed shoes. All right, Chapter 8, The Schoolhouse. Her second day of school was less strange than the first because the princess was part of the class now. She was the pupil pet, and the other students accepted her as one of them. They were all ages. She was probably the oldest, though 2 of the boys were as tall and had deepening voices. Most of the girls were middle-sized, the age at which girls play with dolls and jump rope. She had watched them at recess and had held the frayed rope at one end when they asked her to help turn it. And one girl, Liz, the tiniest in the school, was no more than 5, with large blue eyes, an infectious giggle, and a runny nose. Liz's desk was next to Pat's. The little girl held her tongue between her lips in concentration, and she was practicing making letters on her paper. Her bare feet dangled, her legs too short to reach the floor, and she frequently pulled her skirt up to scratch a mosquito bite on her leg. "You should put some lotion on that bite," Pat whispered to her. The child wrinkled her nose and thought about it. "Don't know what lotion is," she said. "Never heard of such a thing." In the castle, an entire room was devoted to remedies. Everything from headache potions to snake bite salves. A gray-haired apothecary was always there to dispense what one might need, and he could also apply leeches and pull teeth if necessary. But of course, the princess realized a poor peasant had no room of remedies. Don't know why I can't say that. No apothecary, no lotions. "Oh dear," she replied to the little girl. "I happen to have some, though I am a very humble and needy peasant myself. Tell your ma I'll bring something tomorrow for you." and you won't have to scratch so frequently." Liz looked up from her misshapen A's and B's. "Got no ma," she said matter-of-factly. "Oh my, pity. Well, your pa then. Tell him." "Got no pa either." "But—" "I'd be an orphan," Liz explained. An orphan! The princess knew of such people. She had heard stories about them. They frequently appeared in fairy tales. But here was one in person. "But where do you live? Who takes care of you?" The princess couldn't imagine being so small and having no one. "Oh," the little girl explained matter-of-factly, "I stay with whoever wants me, 'cause they think maybe I can help out. Then when they don't want me no more, I go live with somebody else." "You must be very forsaken and pathetic," the princess said sympathetically. "I'm actually quite interested in orphans," and she felt a sharp tap upon her shoulder and realized that a shadow had fallen across her desk. The schoolmaster was standing beside her and had used his pointing stick to tap her into attention. "Sorry, sir," she said quickly and looked down at the geography book she was supposed to be studying. An outline map showed all the domains and beyond them the seas, which were dotted with small, intricately rendered drawings of serpents and whales rising from the foam. The other children laughed at her at lunch. On her first day, the day before, she had brought none, and they had nicely shared torn-off bits on her own thick bread. Once, the pudgy boy named Fred had given her his apple. She had never eaten a whole one before, because at the castle, apples were always served peeled and sliced and arranged on a porcelain plate. "How primitive this is!" the princess exclaimed in delight, as she bit through the skin, following the example of the others. "How peasanty!" "What?" Fred asked. "I just meant, blimey, what a good-tasting apple!" the princess explained and dabbed some juice from her chin. "I'll bring you another tomorrow. I got a whole apple by my house. A whole apple tree by my house." And he had. She thanked him for it and added it to the lunch she had brought today, her own castle breakfast wrapped in a napkin. "What you got there?" one girl, Nell, asked, staring at her lunch. "It's toast, just bread, same as you, but toasted over a fire." "And cut in fancy pieces," Nell pointed out, laughing. She called the other girls to see. "Looky what Pat's got here in her lunch." And they all giggled. The princess, looking at her own cold toast, realized that peasant bread would not be cut into neat triangles as this was. She had so much to learn about being humble and poor. "I just did it to be silly and foolish," she explained, and laughed with them at the same time, hiding the crisp bacon under her napkin. "Where be your lard?" Nell asked. "Lard?" "Your pig fat, to rub on the bread." "Blimey, I got lots. Want some of mine?" The princess looked with horror at the glistening, thick glob of white fat that Nell graciously offered. "Thank you," she said, "but, my belly's full, just room for apple." She folded her napkin around the toast and bacon, bit into the bright red apple skin, and was relieved to see the lard disappear back into Nell's lunch. "Pat!" the tiny waif Liz came scampering to her from the bushes that ringed the schoolyard. "I had me a bird," she wailed. "What I was taming with scraps of me lunch bread, to be a pet, so I would have something to cuddle. Now I think a cat has gone and eat him." "Oh no!" the princess cried. "Did you see it happen?" She looked to where the child was pointing and saw her own pet lying spread out, bulging belly exposed in the sun. "No, but the cat's got feathers stuck to his whiskers. Blue ones like my bird." The princess sighed. "It's delicious." Liz burst into tears. "Maybe it is to a cat, but it was me pet bird he ate." The princess patted her back, attempting to comfort her, planning at the same time how to provide the orphan with, what was it she had said she wanted? Something to cuddle? One of the advantages of being royalty was that, though life was boring, it did provide an opportunity to acquire anything she wanted. She could easily get a pet for this lonely child. She could order a singing bird, even a pair of them, perhaps in a gilded cage. But how to get them to little Liz anonymously? She needed to give it some more thought, but now the bell was ringing. She could see the schoolmaster, and he was handsome, she thought, very handsome indeed, even if Tess, the chambermaid, had said he had a fierce face, standing on the steps, shaking the bell to summon them back to their desks. He detained her at the end of the school day. "Pat," he said, "I'd like you to stay for a minute, if you will." The other pupils filed nervously past her on the way to the door. "Punishment," one whispered sympathetically. "Hope it doesn't be too harsh." punishment. The princess had never been punished for anything, never in her life. Apprehensively, she waited at the desk until the schoolroom was empty. The schoolmaster, who stood at the door at the end of each day to say goodbye to his students, strode past her to his tall desk at the front. She noticed again his soft leather shoes and remembered what Tess the chambermaid had confided, that the schoolmaster was part of a noble family in another kingdom, though he pretended otherwise. His mouth was set in a firm line and his brow was furrowed so that he looked very stern when he summoned her to his desk. "Come forward," he said curtly. Odd, the princess thought, how often she had been the one to summon and command. How easy it was to do that. How hard, how demeaning to be the one summoned. One didn't know exactly what to do or where to look. She stood before him, her hands at her sides, and she looked at the floor and her own bare feet. Then, as an afterthought, she curtsied. "Yes, sir," she said. "I wanted to speak to you privately," he said, "about your schoolwork." "Sir," she replied, "I'll try harder. I'm new, and I didn't know the way to go about things, and so I skipped ahead in the book. I knew I shouldn't, but see the pictures of sea serpents. I never been near no sea, but I was interested in them things, and I skipped ahead without permission. I won't do it again, sir. No, I won't." Then she curtsied once more. He was staring at her. She continued her lengthy apology. "And I know I kept leaning across to the orphan when she was working on her circles. I just thought I could help, sir. She's a pathetic orphan and has no ma nor pa what could help her at home. Also, she has mosquito bites, sir, what itch her fiercely. I'm a poor peasant girl, remember, sir, and I hope you won't whip me, 'cause my pa was killed by a lion. No, a wild boar it was." "I'll try harder," she said again, and then fell silent. The schoolmaster pulled out his handkerchief and held it to his mouth. His shoulders shook for a moment. Then he folded his handkerchief and looked sternly at her, his mouth set in a line. "I simply wanted to commend you, Pat," he said. "Your schoolwork is quite extraordinary. I don't know where you came from or where you attended school before. Some other domain, I forget what. Be that as it may, you were well taught. How old are you, Pat?" "Soon 16, sir. 4 days," she thought. He frowned, thinking. "I was 16 when I left the village school and went far distant to study at a teacher's academy. You might think about preparing to do the same. I could help you with the preparation if you like." "But I'm a girl, sir," the princess pointed out. "A poor peasant one," she added, very humble and pathetic. "Yes, well, I understand that, but there were some girls at the teacher's academy. So, although unusual, it is not unheard of. You might like to think about it, that's all. You may go now, Pat." "Yes, sir, I will do that. I'll think about it. When I have time, though, right now, I must hurry back to my hut. I'm in my hovel, to help with the..." Desperately, the princess tried to remember what hard-working peasants actually did. "Pigs, that's it. I must tend to the pigs. A very dirty and thankless job, and I believe I might milk a cow as well, sir. Quite hard on the hands. And what's the other? Yes, collect firewood. I must bend over and get a very achy back collecting firewood. Oh, it's a difficult life indeed, sir." She looked up at last and saw he was laughing. "Blimey," she said without thinking. "You're wicked handsome when you laugh, sir." Then she curtsied and fled. I don't think I would have said that out loud, but she did. Chapter 9. The Prince. Prince Percival of Pustula dressed entirely in black always. Even his underclothing was black. His hair had once been a nondescript brown, but he kept it dyed jet black and thickly oiled. His mustache as well. Black matched the darkness of his moods. He was always depressed, and in fact the color matched his heart. Percival was a black-hearted man who hated his subjects, the Pustulans, and the populace of his domain, who hated his own family. He had sentenced his own mother to a minimum security prison 7 years before, and he did not venture there on visiting days, never had, not once, and on the most recent Father's Day, he had given his aged father a tarantula, and who, in truth, hated everyone but himself. He spent a great deal of time in front of the mirror. He had his own bedchamber lined with mirrors so that he could view himself from every angle. He preened, he strutted. "Right, Pip? Ah, yes," he cooed to his own image on a Sunday morning, as he stood sideways in his underwear and observed his own stance and the jut of his hip bone. pecs, he murmured, and he changed his position so that he could see the muscles of his chest bulge around the shoulder straps of his black silk undershirt. Oh, nice, he said admiringly, turning slightly to the left and then to the right. He smoothed his hair and then wiped his hand free of the hair oil, using the bedsheet and leaving a smear of black dye. He looked at his clothing, draped over a nearby chair. As he did so, he bellowed, "Valet!" A valet is a sort of manservant, the one who tends to the wardrobe and the needs of a nobleman. The Prince of Pustula's valet was a thin, mild-mannered, middle-aged man who had astonishingly no name. Once he had. His parents, upon his birth, named him Hal. He had been Hal through his school years and during his quite successful career as an imposter of Far East goods. An importer of Far East goods. Then, unfortunately, he had been summoned before the prince because of a tiny snag in a pair of black silk socks imported from Asia. Hal, the importer, had been terrified by the summons. He knew what such a command had meant to the others in the past. There were egg suppliers in exile, dentists in dungeons, and even a trouser presser locked away in a tower, all because of small flaws in their work. Trembling, he had gone before the prince and knelt, as was required. Prince Percival flung the snag sock at him and shouted obscenities. Feeling he had nothing to lose, Hal picked up the sock and examined it while the prince continued to roar and shriek. With his thumb and forefinger, he repaired the tiny snag by pushing a thread through and then smoothing it straight. Then, with his head bowed, he held the flawless sock up in a conciliatory and supplicating gesture. The prince grabbed it. He looked at it. He turned it over and over in his thin-fingered hands. "It's fixed," he shouted. "Yes, sir." "It was unfixable." Hal did not know what to say. It was against the law not to answer the prince, but it was also against the law to answer him with a no. In desperation, he replied, "Yes, sir," agreeing, though he knew it was not true, that the sock had been unfixable. "You performed a haberdashery miracle." Hal did not know what the word haberdashery meant. He did know he had not performed a miracle, but at this point he felt he had no choices left. Lie or be executed, he thought. "Yes, sir," he said. "You will be my new valet. Your new name is Valet." And thus Hal's future had changed. Once he'd been a successful, well-traveled man with business contacts in many domains. He had owned a camel and a horse. He had several maids. He had hoped to become affianced soon, to become engaged, to the daughter of a rug merchant. But now he was a lowly valet, and even his name had disappeared. On this morning, summoned by the prince's bellow, he hurried into the room carrying his valet equipment. "Dress me," the prince commanded. The valet bowed and began. First, he opened the small suede bag that he had carried and removed a soft brush with lemur hair bristles. He picked up the black satin shirt with voluminous sleeves that was draped over the corner of the chair, examined it, brushed it meticulously, then held it while the prince slid his arms into the sleeves, shivering with delight at the feel of the slick fabric. The valet buttoned his shirt and its cuffs as the prince gazed at himself in the mirror. Next, the valet lifted the velvet trousers from the chair and brushed them assiduously. He took out a perfume spray bottle from his bag and sprayed the trousers. He examined each button and tested the zipper. Then, convinced to his relief, for he worried terribly each morning, that the trousers were in perfect condition, he knelt and held them discreetly in just the right position for the prince to insert his legs one after the other. He raised the trousers and slipped the suspenders over the satin-covered shoulders of the prince. Prince Percival posed in front of the mirror, flexing one knee at a time to assess the fit. Marvelous thighs," the prince murmured to his own image. He tossed his head, looked into the mirror again, and shouted, "Brush, idiot!" The valet hurried forward with his second brush, a smaller one made from the hair of a tapir's tail. Gently he brushed the prince's shoulders, which in the few short moments since he had been clothed had become peppered with white flakes of dandruff. It was an affliction of the prince's for which there seemed no remedy, and despite the thick lubricants with which he coated his dyed hair, the dandruff still fell like a perpetual blizzard. Part of the valet's job was to accompany the prince everywhere, brushing his shoulders unobtrusively at intervals. The prince leaned forward toward the mirror, fingering his mustache and examining his pores. "I'm planning to marry," he told his valet. The valet tried to hide his surprise. Who would marry the prince? He couldn't imagine. "I'm pleased to hear that, sir," he said, and leaned forward to brush away a fresh torrent of flakes. "Will you be making a public announcement?" "I have to press my suit first," the prince replied. He leaned even closer to the mirror. "Toothpick!" he bellowed suddenly. The valet handed him an ivory toothpick and waited while the prince probed his teeth, found a morsel left from breakfast, examined it, and then ate it a second time. The valet took the used toothpick and wrapped it in a cloth to be sterilized. He brushed the prince's left shoulder. "Just tell me which suit, sir. I have the ironing board at the ready in the laundry room. I'll press your suit." Prince Percival whirled toward him, spraying dandruff everywhere. "Imbecile!" he shouted. Terrified, the valet stepped back. "I'm a suitor. Got that, you half-wit moron? Suitor. It's not very nice." "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." He didn't really. "Pressing my suit means that I must go through the formality of wooing my intended. It's a tedious, ridiculous bit of nonsense, but I will be going to a ball on Saturday night to press my suit. Got it, idiot? To press my suit." "Yes, sir. I see, sir. By the way, idiot's a mean word. Don't call anybody an idiot." The valet stepped out of saliva range. Each time the prince said a word that began with the letter P, saliva accompanied the sound. Between the flying dandruff and the globs of spewing liquid, and in addition to the clouds of foul-smelling breath, the valet felt as if he were being attacked by airborne weaponry. He hoped the prince would not say anything else that began with the letter P. The prince, calmer now, smoothed his oiled hair and practiced some slow smiles in the mirror. Teeth exposed, teeth partially exposed, teeth concealed. He wasn't sure which smile to use on his intended when they met at the ball. They were all, he thought, so attractive. "Wouldn't you like to know the name of my intended?" he asked the valet. "Yes, sir, I would." The prince sighed with pleasure, releasing a particularly terrible cloud of bad breath. "Oh, Princess Patricia Priscilla. We will be a Prince Percival and Princess Patricia Priscilla, a perfect pair," he said. That's a tongue twister. The valet excused himself politely and rushed to the bath chamber to wash the saliva from his face. Oh my gosh, that's pretty funny. So we're going to stop there at the end. We just finished chapter 9. So next week we will pick back up with chapter 10 and we'll read another few chapters. So stay tuned for that. Everybody have an awesome Friday and a great weekend.